Late Friday afternoon, the Trump administration released its 2026 National Defense Strategy, a once-per-presidential-term document that broadly lays out the Pentagon's goals for the next few years. Now, ordinarily, you would release something on a late Friday afternoon because you do not want anyone to pay attention to it. Everyone is busy focusing on their weekend plans, which in the United States was less about going to the beach and more about preparing for the snowpocalypse. Well, not on this channel. Nothing can distract us from such a critical document. What's this? Beijing just purged its top general? Okay, but certainly the weekend news channels will not have anything else to cover. Oof, ice shooting in Minneapolis. Well, hold that thought for a minute. For the headlines about the National Defense Strategy that did emerge, a common refrain from them was to the effect of, Pentagon drops China as the top threat in dramatic, with scare quotes, new defense strategy. And judging by the comments on social media that follow those articles, the sentiment regarding the document only got worse from there. However, very little of that headline is true for practical purposes. It is hardly a new defense strategy. There is little that is dramatic in it, especially given what we have grown accustomed to with the Trump administration. And the dropping of China as the top threat ignores both what was already the case, as well as the holistic goals of the strategy. And I do not want you to take my word for it. If you care enough about these issues to be listening to this channel, you can read the National Defense Strategy for yourself over breakfast. It is only 34 pages, including covers and blank pages, plus various star-spangled interruptions to keep your patriotic attention. For those of you looking for some pre-guidance, let's get a quick background first on what the document is, because I suspect that you may be getting a feeling that we've done this once before rather recently. And indeed, we did, with the National Security Strategy from November. Well, the National Defense Strategy takes the National Security Strategy and tries to turn it into more actionable policies. It serves as a guideline for lower-level officials in the Pentagon and elsewhere, so it is worth reading, contrary to the usual warning. It is further distinct from the National Security Strategy, because the individuals who write it tend to come from more of a defense bureaucracy background, with the caveat that Pete Hegseth runs the Pentagon. He is a political appointee, and ultimately he signs off on it. By comparison, the National Security Strategy is more of a political document that the White House writes in consultation with the Pentagon. Think of the National Defense Strategy as less of Trump's specific vision of national security, and more as the strategies that career defense officials want to execute, given the broad constraints that the administration has laid out. And as a general point here, I think that there is a public misunderstanding about how policy is crafted in practice in the United States. The easy perception to have is that the president says something, and then everyone goes and does it. The reality is that the various bureaucracies in the United States do things, and then the president decides whether to reject them and start all over again. Without boring you with abstract bargaining theory, the actor with proposal power has incredible leverage over someone who can only veto policy. That is especially true for a technical field like international security, where the veto player, Trump in this case, may be unaware of the real issues. Just something else to keep in mind whenever you see someone associate a U.S. defense policy specifically with Donald Trump. Rather, Trump receives a menu of options, constrained by what career officials and experts are willing to put in front of him. This is part of the reason why the administration spent the first few months in office trying to reset the bureaucracy, to have more of the lower-level positions filled with ideological allies. That is also why many inside of Congress started getting antsy, as it reduces consistency in U.S. policy across administrations. For our purposes today, this creates a tension where there are people in the White House who support domestic policies that create political frictions inside of the United States, while the average career official in the Pentagon might look at these things and think, well, that certainly is not helping our international standing. That goes double now that ICE funding may cause a government shutdown. The betting markets jumped from an 11% chance of that happening on Friday to a 74% chance on Saturday. Now, usually the military is mostly exempt from that, but their pay is withheld during the shutdown, which hurts long-term recruiting. It also does bar things like civilian employees from doing their jobs at places like the war colleges, which again causes long-term problems. Perhaps we will revisit this when we get closer to the shutdown date. Anyway, getting back to the document itself, the top line here is that, with a notable exception, the document is similar to what you might suspect would come from a Democratic president. A lot of the headlines and social media reaction is summarized by the table of contents itself, which puts the homeland and hemisphere above the People's Republic of China, with the implication, apparently, that China is not that important anymore. But let's discuss 1. The practical implications here, and 2. Whether it is a change from anything that we have seen before. The second bit is easier. This is the table of contents from last year's National Security Strategy. Its ordering is the same as Friday's National Defense Strategy, so no changes, no surprises. Friday just calls it China instead of the more generic Asia labeling. Getting to the remaining question, we need to understand the Pentagon's more holistic approach to the strategy. I can summarize the entire thing in basically 5 points. 1. The United States must prevent attacks on the domestic homeland. 2. Overseas powers cannot be allowed to control countries in the Western Hemisphere. 3. It would be super fantastic if China played nice, but we absolutely, positively cannot allow Beijing to expand its reach to the first island chain. 4. Allies, particularly in Europe, must continue to increase their own military spending. And 5. The United States needs to supercharge its defense industrial base. If that all sounds kind of boring, it is because it is kind of boring. 90% of that could have come from the Biden administration and not been surprising. The part that is uniquely Trump is the type of focus on border security. Border issues were a concern for the Biden administration too, in the form of terrorist attacks. But in the depths of Trump's version, you start to get discussions of a flood of illegal aliens and narcotics traffickers in our hemisphere. But the prioritization of the Western Hemisphere that ostensibly downplays China includes the standard Monroe Doctrine policy of keeping every other power out of the continent. And with the exceptions of Russia previously in Venezuela, maybe in Cuba, and possibly in the future in Greenland, the only country that is a threat on this front is China. As such, this is hardly moving away from keeping China as the main pacing threat. I suspect that part of the media perception of a drift away from coercing China is that the document adopts the language of, quote, seeking a stable peace, fair trade, and respectful relations with China, end quote, perhaps as though this is falling back to a spheres of influence concession, where the United States permits Chinese hegemony in the Indo Pacific in exchange for staying out of the Americas. But let's go deeper and actually read from the document. The National Security Strategy directs the Pentagon to maintain a favorable balance of military power in the Indo Pacific, not for the purposes of dominating, humiliating, or strangling China. To the contrary, our goal is far more scoped and reasonable than that. It is simply to ensure that neither China nor anyone else can dominate us or our allies. A decent peace, on terms favorable to Americans, but that China can also accept and live under, is possible. Would you look at that? It is almost like war is inefficient, and the parties would both be better off if they found a resolution commensurate with the balance of power. Well, that is the philosophy that the document is taking with China, and anyone with a bit of background in crisis bargaining theory would tell you that it is the right one. I have 4 more quick points, and then we will call it a day. 1. The National Security Strategy received much criticism for not specifically referencing Russia, and instead talking around the Kremlin by discussing the need for Europe to increase defense spending. Well, you might have noticed that Russia has its own section heading this time around, and it includes discussions of Russia's nuclear, undersea, space, and cyber capabilities. The emphasis of Europe's responsibility for continental security remains, though. 2. The document takes a relatively cooperative tone as compared to the national security strategy. You might remember the previous commentary about Europe having lost its confidence, and that great replacement stuff from before. Well, again, the national defense strategy is more bureaucratic and less political, and accordingly you are seeing the absence of that rhetoric. 3. It reiterates the US position in NATO. The department will also continue to play a vital role in NATO itself, even as we calibrate US force posture and activities in the European theater to better account for the Russian threat to American interests, as well as our allies' own capabilities. After that run-on sentence, it then discusses burden sharing among the European NATO allies. I suspect that this was written before the Greenland gaslighting, but you may have noticed that Trump was saying similar things during that saga, even if he does not fully grasp the burden sharing that happened in Afghanistan. Finally, another common framing of the document is as a U.S. withdrawal from security affairs more generally, with the headline often highlighting the burden-sharing language. Now, there are two ways that you could share a burden. One is that you pay more and I pay less. 2 is that you pay more and I maintain my spending, or even increase it to some degree. Regionally, there will be spending decreased. We already discussed Europe, but South Korea is also mentioned in the strategy. I should note that previous presidents have tried doing the same thing before, Richard Nixon most memorably, and did not have success. We will see if this time is any different. What the United States is not doing, however, is lowering spending overall. We could see that with Trump indicating that he wanted to increase U.S. defense spending by 50% prior to this document's release. Well, a substantial chunk of the document outlines increasing the U.S. defense industrial base, including everything from classic weapons to cutting-edge drones. This is almost entirely targeting China. China is the only country that can challenge the United States in an industrial war. The Pentagon certainly does not need an overload of metal to handle North or South American security affairs, and we have seen that Russian production struggles to make pushes in Ukraine. More aircraft carriers, for example, would allow the United States to handle more problems at once, as the Venezuela/Iran trade-off showed is a problem. But if you are producing tanks and planes and howitzers, then China is the priority. So if you want to let money be your real indicator of the Pentagon's plans, then that tells you what you need to know. Meanwhile, if you thought hearing me blabber on about one specific document was fun, well, I guess you are my kind of weird. But aside from that, I just posted the first lecture of my IRL Introduction to International Relations class. It is on my Lines on Maps Extra secondary channel. There will be a new lecture there posted every Saturday for the next 3 months. But for now, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.